Muslim-Western relations are under the spotlight again after widespread protests over an anti-Islam film made in the US and cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad in a French magazine. Do these demonstrations have the potential to alter policies, and what should be done on both sides to stem anger? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuli Batibo. Western diplomatic missions in Muslim countries are on high alert as protests against a film and cartoons mocking the Prophet Muhammad spread. In Pakistan, the government declared Friday a national holiday to allow people to protest peacefully against the film. But there were clashes in Peshawar and Karachi, and demonstrators have tried to storm the US embassy in Islamabad but have so far been prevented by the Pakistani armed forces. Now, in a bid to calm the public anger, the US has bought airtime on Pakistani television channels to run a series of ads. Imran Khan reports.
America launches its own video campaign.
Since our founding, the United States has been a nation that respects all faiths. We reject all efforts to denigrate the religious beliefs of others.
This advertising campaign will run on local Pakistani television. It's an attempt to diffuse protests over a web trailer for a film that ridicules Islam's Prophet Muhammad.
That the United States government had absolutely nothing to do with this video. We absolutely reject its content and message.
Now, while these comments are not new from the President and the Secretary of State, the State Department feels they have not been reported widely enough in the country. So they've bought airtime to the tune of $70,000 in a bid to get their message across. US State Department spokeswoman Victoria Nuland made the announcement, saying, "In the case of Pakistan, it's common and traditional to have to buy airtime on Pakistani TV for public service announcements. So in that environment, it was their recommendation that we buy some airtime to make sure that the Pakistani people would hear the President's messages and the Secretary's messages." But it's not only the ad campaign. The US Embassy in Islamabad sent out street interviews with Americans to local media, with one very clear message.
I don't think the video that was released represents American values or beliefs in any way whatsoever. We're a pluralistic country, and we have people from every race and religion and creed here, and we tolerate everything, and we think that everybody should be open to every religion and types of belief.
I'd say to anyone who's offended by these videos or these statements or cartoons even, they're not to be taken seriously. They don't represent the views of most or any of the citizens that I know, and the best way to deal with them is to ignore them.
But protests in the capital have been ongoing. On Thursday, rioters tried to get to the heavily guarded US Embassy. According to the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, it's unlikely an advertising campaign like this will make any difference to those showing anger towards the US.
It's an interesting tactic, buying TV ads on Pakistani stations. I doubt it will have much impact, though. These protests, at least the ones that happen today and are likely to happen tomorrow, seem to be orchestrated by hardline Islamic groups that aren't really sympathetic to these kinds of messages coming from the US government. They're looking to pressure the Pakistani government and boost their own support base. So those aren't the type of people that are going to be responsive to this kind of message.
But given the current level of anti-US sentiment in Pakistan, it's unlikely that such an ad campaign will change opinions en masse. Pakistan has declared Friday Love Your Prophet Day, and it's a national holiday. Imran Khan, Al Jazeera.
Well, it's not the first time Muslims have demonstrated against what they perceive as offensive to their religion. Here are a few recent examples. In 2006, cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad published in a Danish newspaper sparked riots in several countries. Dozens died in the violence. In 2011, President Obama was forced to apologize for the burning of copies of the Quran by U.S. Pastor Terry Jones, calling the act extreme intolerance and bigotry. And more recently, in February 2012, Afghans were outraged over the burning of copies of the Quran at a U.S. base. President Obama again apologized for what he said was an inadvertent error and promised to take appropriate steps to avoid any recurrence. But are apologies and condemnation enough? What should be done on both sides to stem the anger and improve relations? Well, to answer this, we're joined by our guests in London, Anas al-Tikriti, CEO of Cordoba Foundation. It's a group working to promote better understanding between the Muslim world and the West. In Washington, D.C., David Mack, a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs. He's also a former U.S. diplomat to Libya. And in New York, Mehmet Kalyoncu, advisor to the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, ambassador to the United Nations. Welcome all to the program, gentlemen. Thank you very much for being on Inside Story today. Anas al-Tikriti, if I may start with you. As we've said, it's not the first time that we're seeing this type of anger in the Muslim world. Do these protests have any meaningful impact, any effect at all on relations between governments in the West and those of Muslim countries?
I don't think that they'll change anything. I think that the pertinent questions remain. I think that the relationship as a whole between the West and the Muslim world is slightly problematic. Slightly, I say, simply because it's been bettered from the advent of the Arab Spring. Now we have a number of countries where the people themselves have a voice. Before, any channel communication was entirely between governments, and governments in the Arab and largely the Muslim world weren't really representative of their people, and therefore there was quite a substantial disparity in terms of the communication channels. But it remains problematic simply because I believe that there remains this misunderstanding of the other. You see, the thing is that, to be honest, whilst we're discussing a film and whilst we're discussing the riots that we saw on the various media, actually I think it's about neither. This is all about the dynamics of power, about a people that feel that they are still being seen as lessers of an equal, and therefore any kind of criticism that is directed towards them or their faith, or any kind of sacred relics and icons and figures and such, is seen as an insult, not just as a mere constructive criticism or something that ought to be taken in people's strides.
But
so
is
the issue of equality
just
in this particular dynamic.
Just on that point, is protesting really the only mean to express this discontent and express this anger? Why not go to the United Nations and call for, demand a resolution that would condemn all blasphemous blasphemous language towards whether it's Islam or other religions? Why not use other means of protest?
Well, there's nothing wrong with protesting. I mean, ultimately, free people ought to feel, free to protest if they see the need to. What we're against and what we condemn outrightly is the violence and the kind of riots that we saw that ultimately led to the killing of innocent people, as well as to the burning of public buildings. So protesting isn't the problem per se. And I agree with you. I think that there are many, many channels in which people can express their condemnation of what we saw in terms of the film that really was nothing but a vile production. And to be absolutely honest, in the conversations that we've been having with the people on the streets, they all recognize the fact that these pockets of rioters that went on this rampage were the minority, whereby the overwhelming response was a very reasonable, quite commendable, quite civil kind of expression of bewilderment and disappointment rather than actual anger as we saw come through the TV screens.
David Mack in Washington, D.C., you've been on the inside. We're seeing Washington, it seems, somewhat on damage control mode right now, especially as far as what's happening in Pakistan. Do you see this current controversy having a lasting impact on the U.S.'s relationship with these Muslim countries?
I think that the impact is going to be an extended one. And I say that because when people cross over from peaceful protests or even insults and then engage in violent acts, terrorist acts, kill diplomats, firebomb embassies, the reaction of my government, fully supported by the U.S. people, is to close down those embassies. Right now, students in Tunisia who want to get visas to the United States are unable to do so because the embassy's closed down. The U.S. has issued a travel warning so that you're not going to get American tourists going to Tunisia. In Libya, where they're desperate to have American businessmen come in, again, operations are closed down, and it's going to be quite a while before we can repair this damage.
Mehmet Kalyoncu in New York, you know, for many Americans, it would seem that freedom of speech means that you can talk about Islam, you can talk about Christianity and Judaism and say whatever you want. So what are we seeing here? Is this a clash of values, in your opinion?
Well, I guess it's a clash of perceptions of the other, as Mr. Tikriti mentioned. And you made an excellent point. Why don't people go to multilateral platforms like the United Nations? And this is actually what the OIC has been doing. OIC Secretary General has been calling for since 2006, when the infamous caricatures published in a Danish newspaper. And back then, there was a huge gap between the perceptions on how to deal with this kind of derogatory publications. And at the call of the OIC Secretary General, then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and the EU High Commissioner Javier Solana, they jointly issued a statement condemning condemning the abuse of right to freedom of expression to denigrate people and their values and religious figures. And the OIC called for a resolution and initiated a process at the Human Rights Council, which gave fruit to the historic resolution 1618, which calls combating with denigration and discrimination against persons.
But this doesn't seem to be enough. I'm sorry to interrupt you, because you're talking about the OIC here, and I do want to bring up that point, because the OIC, along with the Arab League, have made a statement regarding these latest events. The Secretary General of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, as well as the Arab League and the AU Commissioner for Peace and Security, along with the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security, issued a joint statement regarding this anti-Islam film. And in this statement, they decided to reach an international consensus based on tolerance and complete respect of religions. They also called on political, secular and religious leaders to promote dialogue and mutual understanding. And they reiterated their condemnation of recent attacks on diplomatic missions. And finally, they added that the anti-Islam film was a product of small groups of people who didn't represent the societies which they come from, but the damage resulting from these kinds of actions could be huge. But yet there's still many people who see the OIC and other organizations, whether the Arab League and so on, as not doing enough in this crisis. What do you respond to them?
Well, actually, we are doing a lot, but perhaps we have not been able to communicate this to the wider public. Actually, when the resolution 1618 was adopted at the Human Rights Council, OIC Secretary General Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu and the U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, they jointly started an initiative called Istanbul Process to encourage the implementation of that historic resolution, and to create sort of a culture, a global culture to respect the sacred of the others. And that initiative was followed up in New York at the UN General Assembly with the adoption of a similar resolution. And I guess at this point, what needs to be done is to give support to this Istanbul process, and to encourage not only the political leaders, but the wider public, religious leaders, academics, journalists, to support this kind of understanding, to respect the others' values and religions and beliefs.
Anas al-Tikriti, sorry to interrupt you. I just want to bring in Anas al-Tikriti in London on this particular point. What do you see, Anas al-Tikriti, as a role of these Muslim organizations like the OIC, the Arab League, as being? Do these organizations and the governments in these countries, in fact, whether Pakistan or these other Muslim countries, are they doing enough, in your opinion, to avoid these type of crises that we've seen in the last week and so on? Are they doing enough to stem the anger?
Well, there's a lot being done. I agree with that, and I also agree with your guest's assessment that maybe that those efforts aren't being filtering to the grassroots, and therefore most people don't really understand and don't know what's going on behind the scenes, and maybe that needs to be developed. But you have to realize, you have to understand the context. We are talking about a region which, till now, is by far a region whereby there is this problematic relationship between the officialdom, governments, i.e., and all governmental organizations, and between the people. And therefore, for far, far too long, the people have felt a sense of disconnection from the outside world, that they don't have anyone to speak on their behalf. What needs to be done is that either the OIC or the Arab League or any other organizations, there are now plenty of civil society organizations that deal with these issues, their role needs to be amplified. Their roles and the achievements need to be relayed to the people, so that ultimately the people feel that there is a platform from which their anger, their emotion, their gratitude in future circumstances, let's hope, is being conveyed to the outside world. Till now, we have this kind of disparity. But just coming back to a comment made by your guests in Washington, I feel that the closing down of various embassies in numerous countries, whilst I admit that there is always a security issue with any embassy, not just American embassy, but any embassy in any country in the world that we have today, don't you think that that is, in a sense, quite a disproportionate response? I mean, we talk about disproportionate responses of certain pockets of people here or there in terms of how they exerted or how they demonstrated their anger, but don't you think that closing down embassies and hence shutting down diplomatic means, and as you put it, I mean, visas from one side, tourism from another, don't you think that that in a sense is overplaying it a little?
David Mack?
I don't think that that's a disproportionate response, Anas. I think that is a natural, short-term way of protecting lives of American officials who've gone out to these countries, just like Ambassador Chris Stevens, my good friend who was killed in Benghazi. They've been working in these countries to try to improve relations. None of us want to see a closure of this kind of diplomatic activity that enables the peoples of Muslim countries and the West to have interchanges, to get to know one another better. It's terrible when it happens. But governments do have to make a choice. And we recognize that sometimes governments don't have the capability or capacity right now. And that's certainly true of the Libyan government, which is struggling to rebuild some institutions. There are other cases where governments may have the capacity but don't summon up the will to do what's required to protect diplomatic establishments. That's pretty basic. And in those cases, I can tell you that whatever the Obama administration does, they're going to have a huge demand from the American public to pull our people out and to stop having this kind of interchange.
But David Mack, given the current level of anti-US sentiment, not just in Pakistan but in other countries, is an ad campaign really going to appease these tensions in any way? That doesn't seem to be enough, many people would say.
Well, I think that we have to understand that from the American point of view, people should be protected from violent acts. On the other hand, we have 250 years of our history as a country that places a huge value upon freedom of speech. And frankly, we don't believe that people should be protected from insults. Now, what President Obama and what Secretary Clinton did was, I think, the requirement that is incumbent upon all responsible government officials and religious leaders, leaders of civil society, and media, and that is to condemn hate speech, to condemn attacks on other people's religion. but that's different from criminalizing it. And it was very significant to me that the reason why our embassy in Islamabad had to put an ad in Pakistani newspapers and broadcast the statements of President Obama and Secretary Clinton was because the Pakistani media had failed to do so. They concentrated on the insults from some extremist radical who was totally ignored by 99% of the American population and ignored what the President and Secretary of State were saying.
First to you, Mehmet, in New York. What do you make of what the ambassador just said there? And do you think the U.S. is doing enough to stem this anger in the Muslim world?
Well, I think it would be counterproductive at this point to reduce the level of engagement, U.S. engagement with the Muslim world. Actually, on the contrary, the engagement should be strengthened. And doing otherwise would be sort of tantamount to falling into the trap of the marginal groups that are trying to increase this kind of hatred acts and insults. And following up on Mr. Tikriti's point, I guess, well, speaking of the regional organizations, I guess the OIC is very well positioned to sort of reach out to the wider Muslim world and say that unlike other countries, the freedom of speech is not foreign to the Muslim Islamic faith. It's actually, when you look into the history, it is actually a 1,400-year-old phenomenon. The freedom of speech. We just, the Muslims, we just need to go back to our history and see how free were people back then to express their opinions.
Anas al-Tikriti, what precisely are the sources of this simmering hostility towards the U.S. that's helped fuel these demonstrations in the Muslim world?
Well, let's redraw the context. Obviously, we're talking about film and we're talking about riots. But let's not forget
more to it, isn't it?
This isn't something that, I mean, it comes at the back of decades long of a relationship that is deeply problematic, and we can't separate one from the other. I mean, the kind of violence that we saw, and which, by the way, was again no more than 2 to 5% of the street that actually came out to protest. The vast majority, the overwhelming majority of the protests were quite civil, quite peaceful, and quite constructive, to be fairly honest. And I would have loved. And by the way, I do commend the official status of the American government and various Western governments in condemning the film, and to be honest, coming out with very, very positive statements that should have, I agree, that should have been relayed properly to the people. But at the same time, I would have also loved for, let's say, the American president or the Secretary of State to come out and also commend the numerous, possibly even hundreds of statements that came out from civil society organizations, from religious figures, from various organizations and countries, also condemning the riots, but at the same time also asking why such a film and such insults hurled towards Islam and Muslims continue to come. Now, there's a question that continues to crop up, and I felt it was one of the underlying things that was mentioned just a few minutes ago, and that is, why can't Arabs and Muslims take criticism? I mean, what's wrong with them? Why is this? The problem is ultimately that when you're less than an equal, it's problematic. The criticism comes across as an insult. This comes at the back of Muslims feeling denigrated from long ago until now. This relationship hasn't been addressed. Right. At the same time, I think it's very, very important to look at the political undertones of this. There are very, very deep political undertones, and unless we take these in consideration, we won't be able. And by the way, why is the West wanting to understand why we're insulted? We're insulted. That's enough. For civil people, that's all it takes for you to stop insulting me. I'm insulted. You don't need to understand why. All
right, David Mack, what do you say to that? How do you respond, and how do you improve this relationship that's been so problematic over all these years?
I basically agree with Anas on this. You know, we've grown very used to the idea of hate speech in the United States. There's all kinds of examples of anti-Christian, anti-Jesus films and so on that are shown in the United States. Churches can bring out groups of people to demonstrate at those movie theaters, But the first time one of those demonstrators picks up a rock and tries to throw it through the window of the movie theater, that is a crime. And so the U.S. approach is one of accepting all kinds of very, very vicious, vile speech and combating it essentially with other speech. And I realize this is not well understood in the rest of the world. And I just hope that we can do a better job of conveying through the media, through organizations like that of Anas and Mahdi's organization, the Organization of the Islamic Conference. I agree. They've made some very positive statements. And I hope that they could get spread around a little bit more in Muslim countries. Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you very much indeed for your comments and your perspective on this issue. In London, Anas al-Tikriti. In Washington, D.C., David Mack. And in New York, Mehmet Kalyoncu. Thank you as well for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. As always, if you want to send us your feedback, email us your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks again for watching. Goodbye for now.